All right. Can we start the interview um, by giving me your name and how you're affiliated with the French and/or the Huguenots?
My name is Evan Keating, and my relatives way back on my mom's side of the family were Huguenots who came to the United States. I have a lot of family members that still live in France and tell me about the vast history that our ancestors had.
Okay. So basically, in your own words, what? How would you define a Huguenot, or like what is a Huguenot?
Huguenot is someone who is a Protestant or a French Calvinist. These people are people who were targeted by the Catholic Church in order to prosecute and kill. These people were people that listened and strongly agreed with John Calvin and his philosophy. At the start of the Protestant Reformation, the Huguenots were somewhat living in a peaceful relationship with the Church, yet they were discriminated against and maybe the occasional death, but nothing too bad. However, as history unfolded, there started to be widespread conflicts and fights between the two.
Okay, that's interesting. So where exactly are your parents from?
My parents are from Texas, and I have lived there my whole life. However, I do not know how far it goes back. But on my mom's side, my parents emigrated from France. They were Protestant. We were not Protestant. We're not Protestant anymore, but they were Protestants, and they came over and settled in Florida. They were part of the first group of people to come to the U.S.
Okay, so that's interesting. Do you speak French by any chance?
No, I don't speak French. My mom never taught me. I speak a little bit of Spanish, but teaching me French was not a priority.
That's interesting. For me, my mom is from Brazil, and speaking Portuguese wasn't really a priority, even though it's part of my heritage and part of my family's culture. But yeah, it's interesting because same thing to me. But did you ever hear any stories, of your family members coming from France, or anything about like the Huguenots, or some sort of family history or something like that?
Yeah, we actually have a big book of family history that my great grandfather wrote. This book contains Keating history from way, way back. One thing that was really interesting was the relationships that my family had with English. My relatives were fur trappers, and they were traded a lot with the British, and even occasionally with the Indians. The history from my family in the United States was much happier and had a much higher quality of life than that of when they lived in France.
Okay, that's interesting. Let me see. What's the next question? Um, let's see. Could you imagine? Could you sorry? Could you imagine living in the time of the Protestant Reformation?
No, it was horrific, and thanks for sharing the bit of information on the massacres. I did not know about those specific massacres, but 30,000 people is a lot of people. I would be really scared to live in a world where I could die at any minute. I'm glad I live in a modern era where I do not have to worry about dying. And to risk everything and come to the United States would be really hard for me. To have to start over and create a new life would be something really difficult to me. However, to avoid all the persecution and to make sure that I survive, I would have to flee and start a new life. My family members had to learn to adapt and change to the new culture of America. Surprisingly, they immediately started to thrive and made a really smooth transition. It's interesting to see on your WordPress page that some Protestants actually went to South America and Brazil in order to escape prosecution.
Yeah, there's multiple different locations. They went to Prussia and parts of America, obviously, and South America. But yeah, it's interesting. In Brazil, Brazil's actually dominated by the Catholic Church. So in Brazil, it was they kind of ran into kind of similar problems because Brazil is dominated by the Catholic Church, but they were never persecuted and there was obviously never murdered or anything like that. They lived in peace in all of the places that they went, which was good to hear that because obviously staying in France was not the option there. That the Catholic Church were extremely bad, and they did massacre 30,000 people like over the course of a couple days, or maybe a couple weeks. Um, so yeah, so it was good that they had to flee and immigrate to other countries. So yeah, continuing on to that. Um, let's see why. So yeah, I guess why do you think the Huguenots were persecuted?
I think they were persecuted because they were different than the vast population of France. France at the time was dominated by the Catholic Church, and most everyone was Catholic. This was ingrained into the history of France ever since the birth of the country. The Catholics felt threatened and realized how big the population of the Protestants were. As a result, the Catholics killed them and prosecuted against them. The main reason is that they were different, and being different scares people. It specifically scared the people that were at the top of the Catholic Church, the important members of the church. They were afraid to give up the power and awesomeness that they had. So, as a result, they would do anything and everything to make sure that there was no way they would lose their power. In doing this, they killed a vast population of Protestants, ranging from children to pastors, all pretty much unarmed. They wanted to drive the Huguenots out of their country and make sure they never came back. It's basically the same situation as what Nazis did to the Jews. They slaughtered and discriminated against the Jews to make sure they would never come back to Germany. The Nazis were obviously a bit more harsh, but the idea are basically the same. I'm now
Yeah, so I guess that's a pretty good example. The Nazis, uh, the Nazis and the Huguenots were two groups of people that were very harshly discriminated against, and that's actually a very good example. There are countless times throughout history where uh, a group of people have been persecuted and slaughtered and massacred as a race. Um, and this was common in this time of the Protestant Reformation and all of the religious conflicts that were going on in Europe at the time. It wasn't at the time it wasn't just the Huguenots. Actually, uh, it was uh, the Pilgrims and um, other ethnic groups in Europe. Um,
I hope you don't mind.
And yeah, so considering the Mayflower and the Pilgrims that came over on the Mayflower, they had they had it a lot. They had it a lot better. The Pilgrims did. The Huguenots were mass murdered and executed um, just because of their religious views and basically the fact that they were just so different. This really scared the Catholics, and it made them, really uh, want want them out because they were a threat to the Catholic Church, and you know, um, being that threat, these rich and powerful pastors and people in the Catholic Church, they want to wake up to servers and food in bed and all the richness and the power that they had and the ability to command thousands and thousands of people, and they saw this possibly slipping through their fingers and becoming a fairy tale again if the Huguenots were able to, stand up and fight against the Catholics. And this is a problem because the Huguenots they actually made up a very big population of Europe, or not of Europe, but of Europe, but specifically of France, and they made up an eighth or a tenth of the population, and they were growing, and they were obviously populating and making more babies, so the population was growing exponentially day by day, and the Catholics saw this and they were getting scared. So as a result, to rid their country of these plagues, these bad people, as they would probably say, they executed mass murders, and 30,000 people died in one instance. And there was a wedding of Francis, one of the higher up people in France, and it was his wedding, and there was a murder of a Protestant. He was thrown into the streets from up above, and once people started walking around and seeing this guy's body just uh, crippled and decrepit on the ground, um, people just went crazy and they started to mass murder people, and that's what started the huge massacre of 30,000 people. Um, and it wasn't just in one city; it was spread across the whole country. People were hunting down the Huguenots and killing them, and they were mostly unarmed and children. Even like that's just terrible. I couldn't even imagine that. So, I'm sorry to hear that your ancestors had to come through this, but they not persecuted. They were persecuted, but they overcame adversity and they overcame everything, and they did it for themselves, and they did it for a better future, and they did it for their family. And long story short, they came. They left France and they found better lives for themselves, and they were able to thrive. And in the United States, they even traded with the Indians and the people from England, the English. So this is a good thing for them ultimately leaving and immigrating, because it was something that they had to do. But I'm sorry that your relatives had to go through this. It sounds like something that I couldn't even imagine. But in total, Evan, it was a good interview, and thanks for having me.